All right, so get this. We're diving into conversational hypnosis. You know, handed us this training snippet from Virginie. She's like a French hypnosis expert. And honestly, my first thought was like, is this some secret society for mind control? But then I dug in, and it's actually way more interesting than I thought it would be.
It does have that kind of mystique to it. Yeah. But what we're going to do is break it down. We're going to uncover what conversational hypnosis actually is and how it's different from the traditional hypnosis that most people are familiar with.
So no mind control.
Okay.
Good to know. So then what is conversational hypnosis? Is it like, slipping someone into a trance while you're just making small talk?
Well, that's a funny image. It's a lot more subtle than that. You see, traditional hypnosis often relies on very specific techniques and steps to induce a trance state. Conversational hypnosis starts with a different premise.
Yeah.
That we all experience trance states naturally, like multiple times a day.
Wait, are you saying that like I'm getting hypnotized every day and I don't even know it?
Exactly. Think about it. You know that feeling when you're totally engrossed in a book or you zone out during a really long drive? Those are actually trance states. Eimer calls conversational hypnosis reverse engineering the traditional methods.
Reverse engineering. So instead of, building the trance from scratch, we're kind of tracing it back to its natural origins.
Exactly. Conversational hypnosis strips therapy down to its core, so deep listening, careful observation, and then utilizing those spontaneous trance moments that happen naturally in conversations.
Okay, that makes sense. But this is where it gets a little mind-bending for me. Eimer also emphasizes slowing down to speed up the results. Isn't that kind of counterintuitive? Why would slowing down be more effective?
Well, it's about shifting the focus. By letting go of the pressure to perform these specific techniques, the therapist can become hyper-aware of the client's unconscious communication. Those little subtle shifts in their tone, inconsistencies in their body language, those are the things that we often miss.
So they're like speaking a hidden language. And therapist is kind of tuning into that frequency.
Precisely. And those subtle cues often reveal much more than the client's conscious words. And it's by slowing down that the therapist can really pick up on those.
Wow. So speaking of hidden meanings, Eimer also says that the client's problem is a lie. That's kind of harsh, isn't it?
It's not about accusing the client of being dishonest at all. The idea is that their conscious awareness of the problem, whether it's anxiety or procrastination or whatever they're struggling with, it's just a symptom, not the root cause.
Okay, so like an iceberg, what we see on the surface is just the tip.
Yeah.
And then the real mass of the problem is hidden underneath.
Exactly. The real problem, the root cause, lies hidden in the unconscious.
Yeah.
And that's where conversational hypnosis comes in.
Okay, I think I'm following you. But this is what gets me. If there are no right questions, like Eimer says, how does a conversational hypnotist even begin to unravel all of this? Do they just wing it?
Not quite. It's about cultivating a relentless curiosity. The goal isn't to jump in with some, pre-packaged solution, but to really understand why the problem exists in the first place. It's about guiding the client through this process of unraveling those layers, always following those subtle unconscious cues that they're giving off.
So it's like this delicate dance between observation and intuition.
Yes, very much so. And speaking of intuition, this reminds me of something else that Eimer emphasizes, the importance of the therapist's own inner state.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about the client. The therapist's state of mind plays a role too.
Absolutely. Imagine if the therapist is anxious or unsure, or if they're trying to force a specific outcome. That energy is inevitably going to affect the client and the session.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've noticed that in my own life. If I'm stressed or distracted when I'm talking to someone, it can be hard to really listen and connect.
Exactly. Eimer talks about the therapist needing to cultivate a state of calm curiosity, almost like a meditative presence. This allows them to be truly present with the client and to let the process unfold organically. And that brings us to another key concept. Eimer stresses that there's no need to fix the client. The answers are already within them.
That's a powerful idea. But in this training, we see Eimer working with a participant named Marie, who's actually a therapist herself. And Marie admits that she struggles with overthinking and feeling pressure during sessions.
Which, let's be honest, is something a lot of us can relate to. That feeling of needing to have all the answers. Eimer brilliantly uses Marie's situation as a real-time example of how to approach the hypnotic interview, focusing on deep listening and exploration without judgment.
So it's about holding space for the client to find their own answers, instead of trying to, impose solutions from the outside.
Yes. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about conversational hypnosis. It's a deeply collaborative and empowering process.
I love that. But then how does the therapist actually know if they're getting anywhere? If there are no right questions and no need for solutions, how do they measure progress?
That's where the testing concept comes in. It's about making sure that any changes that happen during the session are truly integrated and lasting. It's not enough to just have a breakthrough in the moment. We need to make sure those changes stick.
So it's like a real-time feedback loop, making sure the client is actually shifting their internal experience.
Exactly. Throughout the session, the conversational hypnotist will use various techniques to test the client's responses, ensuring they're embodying the new resources and perspectives that they've gained. We'll dive deeper into that in a bit. But first, I think it's important to address something that many people wonder about. When they hear the word hypnosis.
You mean the whole mind control fear?
Right. Imir makes it very clear that conversational hypnosis is about empowering the client, not controlling them.
This is more of a partnership then.
Absolutely. The therapist acts as a guide, helping the client to tap into their own unconscious resources. There's no magic wand, no manipulation. The client is always in control.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear. Now, going back to Marie's example, she specifically mentions feeling this intense pressure to have all the answers for her clients, which leads to her overthinking everything.
And this is where we circle back to the importance of the therapist's own internal state. Imir highlights that if the therapist is feeling anxious or uncertain or trying to force a specific outcome, that energy will inevitably seep into the session.
So the therapist's own calmness and clarity are essential.
Precisely. It's about creating a space where both the therapist and the client can be fully present and authentic. And that authenticity is what allows for those profound moments of insight and transformation to occur.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. So to recap what we've learned so far about conversational hypnosis, it's about recognizing those natural trance states, slowing down to truly listen and observe, understanding that the client's problem might just be the tip of the iceberg, and cultivating a curious and non-judgmental mindset. Did I miss anything?
I think you nailed it. It's all about trusting in the client's own inner wisdom and their capacity for change. And remember, the testing concept is key to making sure those changes stick. We'll explore that further in just a bit.
Okay, so we've established that testing is a big part of conversational hypnosis, but it's still not quite clear on what that actually looks like. Like in practice, is it like a pop quiz or something?
Not exactly. Think of it more like a gentle nudge or a way of checking in to see if the shifts that the client is experiencing are truly integrated.
Can you give me like an example?
Sure. Let's say a client comes in and they have anxiety about public speaking. So through the conversation and deep listening, the therapist helps them access a memory of feeling really confident and powerful in a different situation. Now, the testing phase. That's where the therapist would subtly guide the client back to the idea of public speaking and then observe their reaction.
So are they like looking for a shift in their body language or like their tone of voice?
It could be a number of things. Maybe their breathing becomes more relaxed. Maybe their posture changes. Maybe they start to use more positive language. The key is that the therapist is really attuned to those subtle cues and uses them to gauge whether the change is genuine and deeply rooted.
That makes sense. So it's like they're making sure that the new positive experience is actually replacing the old anxious one.
Exactly. And this testing process can be really creative. Imir talks about using metaphors, visualization exercises, even humor, just to see if the client's response is congruent with the desired change.
I like that. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach. It's tailored to each individual client.
Right. And this reminds me of another point that Imir emphasizes, the importance of not getting lost in the content.
What does that mean? Like not getting too caught up in the client's story.
Exactly. It can be easy to get so focused on the details of what the client is saying that we miss those really crucial unconscious cues. We get fixated on those little puzzle pieces, but we're not seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's so true. Even in everyday life, we can get so caught up in our own thoughts and our own narratives that we completely miss what's actually going on around us.
That's a great point. And it highlights how the principles of conversational hypnosis aren't just relevant in like a therapy setting. They can apply to any interaction where we want to understand someone on a deeper level.
So what's the key to not getting lost in the content then? How do we learn to see that bigger picture?
Well, Imir talks about cultivating a kind of peripheral awareness. It's like you're taking in the whole landscape of the client's communication, their words, their tone, their body language, all at once.
I like that analogy. It's like you're standing on a mountaintop, taking in the entire vista. instead of focusing on one particular treat.
Exactly. And that broader perspective, it allows the therapist to notice those subtle inconsistencies, those moments where the client's words don't quite match their unconscious signals.
Okay, so if we're not supposed to get too hung up on the content, how do we know, like, what questions to ask? Imir mentions that there are no right questions, but that can feel kind of daunting.
It's not about having a script. It's about being genuinely curious and following the client's lead. Remember, the goal isn't to extract information. It's to facilitate a process of self-discovery.
So the questions themselves are less important than the quality of attention that we're bringing to the interaction.
Precisely. It's about being fully present, listening not just with our ears, but with our whole being. And that's where the magic happens. Because when we create that space of deep listening and genuine curiosity, that's when the unconscious mind starts to reveal its secrets.
I'm starting to understand how this whole approach can be so transformative. It's like we're peeling back the layers of conditioning and societal expectations to uncover that authentic self underneath.
You're getting it. And that's what makes conversational hypnosis so powerful. It's not about imposing change from the outside, but about facilitating the client's own journey of self-discovery and healing.
I have to admit, I'm still a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Like, how can we be sure that these changes are actually happening at an unconscious level? Isn't it possible that people are just, telling us what we want to hear?
That's a valid question. And that's where the testing phase we talked about earlier becomes even more important. Remember, it's not just about asking questions and observing responses. It's about using very specific techniques to check if the changes are truly integrated.
So can you give me an example of a testing technique?
Sure. One technique Imir mentions is called future pacing. It involves guiding the client to imagine themselves in a future situation where they are successfully using the new resources that they've gained.
So if someone is working on overcoming their fear of public speaking, you might ask them to imagine themselves delivering a presentation with confidence and ease.
Exactly. And the key here is to really observe their response. Do they light up? Does their body language shift? Do they use language that reflects that desired change?
I see. So it's like we're looking for those little clues
Yeah.
that their unconscious mind is buying into this new reality.
Precisely. And if the response isn't congruent, the therapist can adjust their approach and continue exploring until they find a path that leads to genuine, lasting change.
This is so eye-opening. I'm starting to see how the principles of conversational hypnosis can be applied to so many different areas of life, not just therapy.
Absolutely. Think about sales, for example. A really skilled salesperson who understands these principles. They can build rapport quickly by tuning into the customer's unconscious needs and desires.
Or even parenting. Imagine being able to understand your child's unspoken emotions and respond with more empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about this approach. It's not just a set of techniques. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of relating to ourselves and others.
Yeah. Listening to you talk about this, I can't help but think about how much of our communication happens at an unconscious level. We're constantly sending and receiving signals that we're not even aware of.
It's like we're all walking around in this sea of unconscious communication. And the more we learn to tune into those signals, the more we can navigate that sea with skill and grace. But here's something I find really interesting. Even though conversational hypnosis really emphasizes working with the unconscious, Imir doesn't completely dismiss those traditional hypnotic techniques.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought they were like two totally separate things.
They are distinct approaches, but they can also work together beautifully.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Exactly. Conversational hypnosis provides this framework for understanding and working with those natural trance states that we all experience, while traditional techniques can be used as really powerful tools. Within that framework,
like adding spices to a dish, they enhance the flavor. But the dish itself is already delicious.
perfect analogy. Traditional techniques like metaphors, visualizations, or even specific inductions, they can be incorporated strategically to deepen the experience or address particular needs.
Okay, so it's about using the right tool for the job and understanding those underlying principles of how these techniques work.
Precisely. And ultimately, the goal is always the same: to empower the client to access their own inner resources and to create lasting positive change.
I'm curious, can you give me an example of how a traditional technique might be used within that conversational hypnosis framework?
Absolutely. Let's say a client is struggling with chronic pain. A conversational hypnotist might use deep listening and questioning to help the client explore the emotional roots of their pain.
So uncovering the underlying stress or trauma, that might be contributing to their physical symptoms.
Exactly. And once they've accessed those deeper emotional layers, the therapist might then introduce a traditional hypnotic technique like visualization, for example. They might guide the client to imagine a healing light flowing through their body, soothing and releasing the tension.
That's fascinating. So it's like they're using the conversational hypnosis framework to create this safe and receptive space,
Yeah.
and then they're layering in those traditional techniques
Yeah.
to kind of amplify the healing process.
You got it. And the beauty of this approach is that it allows for a truly personalized and transformative experience.
This whole conversation has really highlighted how much potential there is for healing and growth when we tap into the power of the unconscious mind.
It's like we're uncovering these hidden treasures within ourselves. And those treasures hold the keys to profound transformation.
So before we move on, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. We've talked about slowing down, observing those subtle cues, being curious and non-judgmental, and using those testing techniques to ensure that changes last. Is there anything else that's crucial to the success of conversational hypnosis?
Yes. There is one more thing I want to emphasize, and it's perhaps the most important element of all. It's the relationship between the therapist and the client.
So it's not just about the techniques, it's about the connection between two human beings.
Exactly. Imir talks about the need for a deep level of rapport and trust. The client needs to feel safe and understood in order to really open up and allow themselves to be guided.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to be vulnerable and explore those deeper parts of ourselves if we don't feel safe.
Exactly. And that's where the therapist's own authenticity comes in. They need to be genuine, compassionate, and truly present with the client.
So it's about being a human being first and a therapist second.
Yes. And I think that's what sets conversational hypnosis apart from other approaches. It's not about the therapist being the expert with all the answers, but rather a guide, a facilitator on the client's own journey of self-discovery.
You know, that's a really beautiful way to think about it. It's about empowering the client to heal themselves, rather than imposing solutions from the outside.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly empowering for both the client and the therapist.
I could see how that would be true. It creates a much more balanced and respectful dynamic.
I agree. It recognizes the inherent wisdom and capacity for healing that resides within each of us.
Beautifully said. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from the basic principles of conversational hypnosis to its practical applications, and even its ethical considerations.
It's been quite a journey, and we've still got more to unpack. But before we move on, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is there anything that's particularly resonating with you so far?
You know, honestly, what's resonating with me the most is how this all ties back to everyday life. It's like you said, you know, we're swimming in this sea of unconscious communication, and conversational hypnosis gives us the tools to kind of navigate that more effectively. I'm even thinking about conversations I had today, and I'm noticing all these subtle cues I might have missed before.
Yeah, it's amazing how once you start to see it, you just can't unsee it.
Right. And I have to say, this whole idea of like testing to make sure that changes stick, that's really intriguing. It's practical, but it's also kind of playful in a way.
It is playful, and Imir emphasizes that playfulness is actually essential. When the therapist can approach this process with a sense of curiosity and lightness, it creates a more inviting space for the client to explore and experiment.
So it's not about being like overly serious or rigid, but allowing for some spontaneity and fun.
Exactly. Think about it. When we're relaxed and enjoying ourselves, we're much more open to new experiences, and we're more likely to let go of those old patterns. It's like we're giving our unconscious mind permission to play along.
Okay, I'm liking this approach more and more. But I'm also wondering, like, how do we know when to use a traditional hypnotic technique versus just relying on conversational hypnosis? Is there like a rule of thumb?
It's more of an art than a science. A skilled conversational hypnotist, they'll intuitively sense what's needed in each moment. They might start with a purely conversational approach, and then if they sense that the client needs a little extra support, they might weave in a metaphor or a visualization or even a brief guided meditation.
So it's like they're responding to the client's needs in real time, constantly adjusting their approach based on those subtle cues.
That's exactly it. It's very dynamic and responsive.
It sounds like it requires a lot of trust and intuition on the therapist's part.
It does, and that's why Imir stresses the importance of ongoing training and self-reflection. A good conversational hypnotist, they're constantly honing their skills, deepening their awareness, and refining their intuition.
You know what's really fascinating to me is that this approach seems to kind of blur the lines between therapy and everyday life. It's not just something that happens in a therapist's office. It's like a way of being in the world, a way of relating to ourselves and others.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's what makes conversational hypnosis so relevant. You know, in today's world, we're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation and distractions. And this approach invites us to slow down, to truly listen, and to connect with ourselves and others on a much deeper level.
It's like we're reclaiming that lost art of conversation.
Beautifully said. And that brings us back to one of the key takeaways from Imir's training, the power of the unconscious mind. It's this vast reservoir of wisdom and potential that's always available to us if we know how to tap into it.
So if we were to distill all of this down into a few key insights for our listeners, what would you say are like the most important things to remember about conversational hypnosis?
I'd say first and foremost, remember that hypnotic states are a natural part of life. We experience them all the time. Second, slow down, pay attention, and cultivate that relentless curiosity. Third, the client's problem might just be the tip of the iceberg. There's always something deeper to explore. And finally, trust in the power of the unconscious mind and its ability to heal and transform.
Those are great points. Okay, so to wrap things up, what's one thought you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to kind of ponder as they go about their day.
I'd say pay attention to those moments in your own conversations when someone's words don't quite match their body language, or their tone shifts in a way that makes you wonder, what's really going on beneath the surface? Those are glimpses of the unconscious at work, and they hold a wealth of information, not just about the other person, but about ourselves as well.
That's brilliant. It's like this whole hidden world waiting to be explored, both within ourselves and in our interactions with others.
Exactly. And the more we learn to tune into those subtle signals, the more we unlock the potential for deeper connection, understanding, and transformation.
I love that. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into conversational hypnosis. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit mind-bending. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What aha moments did you have? Share your insights with us. Now, let's keep the conversation going.